So welcome back to our ZOiS Lecture Series, what social science research tells us or has told us on Ukraine. And I really look forward to welcoming and then listening to Professor Tamara Martsenyuk. Today, she is a sociologist. She is associate professor at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. She's currently based in Berlin with an affiliation at the Free University. And she will talk to us about women's participation in the Euromaidan and in the war in Ukraine. So this will be both older research and ongoing research that she's engaged in now. Tamara is a sociologist looking in particular, not only, but in particular at gender, at the social structures of society, social inequalities, and many issues related to that. And she is widely published in English and in Ukrainian on these issues. And I think you have been a constant voice for kind of taking gender issues in these big political crises and in war seriously. And so we look forward to your research and your talk now. Thank you very much for participating.
Dear Professor Gwendolyn, Sasse, thanks a lot to you and ZOiS for organizing this series of lectures about Ukraine. I think that now in the situation of this special invasion, it's very important to support Ukrainian studies. And now I will be sharing my screen with my slides. And I will be talking today about women's participation in Euromaidan protests or revolution of dignity and war in Ukraine. And as Professor Gwendolyn said, I am currently a refugee scholar hosted by Ostoyhopa Institute for University of Berlin, and I am very grateful to all my colleagues and people who helped me with evacuation and being in a safe situation and continuing my research on gender aspects and war. And it's really, today is a huge challenge because I have not a lot of time to present my results of research that I've been doing for 80 years. And just in the beginning, I want to explain that my theoretical and methodological perspectives. So first of all, I identify myself as a public sociologist. It means that I'm not a so-called cabinet scholar, and I work with NGOs, with different state authorities, media, and other actors of social change. And we do research in order to change Ukrainian society, to help different vulnerable groups of people. And also my perspective is gender sociology, so you will see some gender theory. And the topic of women's participation in different protests and war, possible to see from different feminist perspectives. And my position is liberal feminism, where it's important for women to be visible and to be involved in different activities. And of course, I'm aware that this position could be criticized by, for example, radical or critical feminism. And I will present today research that I started after Euromaidan protest in 2014. And I will show you some continuity between these events, Revolution of Dignity, war in Donbass, as it started after annexation of Crimea in 2014, and recent Russian invasion. And of course, because Euromaidan protests, they are already history. So my most research and scholarship is on this particular issue. But I do see some legacy, and through the analysis of the women's participation in these events, it's possible to understand why Ukrainian society resists in this terrible war. And my major theses are that international media discourse about Euromaidan was narrow. Events practice is much more diverse. Women were not helpers but participants of the revolution of dignity, and also for women it became possible to fulfill not only so-called traditional or female roles, but to have new niches for egalitarian or emancipatory participation. And theoretically, when doing analysis on women's participation in the revolution of dignity, I divide two major discourses and practices. And it's based on the criticism of sex role theory, and it's based on social constructivist ideas of gender roles from American sociologist Michael Kimmel, Judith Larber, and I divide so-called ideal types as traditional, patriarchal, sexist, discriminatory or exclusive for women discourse, and also more egalitarian, emancipatory or inclusive for women, where women could choose what to do, especially during protests. And as far as I'm teaching courses, not only on gender and feminism, but on masculinity and men's studies, I do have some scholarship on these particular issues and also on LGBT and Maidan. But as far as my topic today is on women's participation, so I only briefly would mention masculinities on Maidan, because of course masculinity, femininity is connected with masculinity. And empirical data of my research as visual and textual analysis of speeches, journal articles, pictures, video materials, posters, street art, and of course, I personally was very involved in all 3-4 months of Euromaidan protests. So I did so-called participant observation and interviews with different people. And to begin with, when we look at major media and their picture of revolution of dignity and Euromaidan protest, very often you could see this so-called glorification of violence, and where hegemonic normative masculinity is positioned on front line of this revolution, when men are heroes who risk their lives. And of course, these activities where you risk your life and where they are very bright, but at the same time, they consisted maybe 2 or 3% of the whole events of 3-4 months. But usually those pictures are very mainstream and they reflect this patriarchal or exclusive for women discourse. And when we look at the scholarship on these ideas, and of course revolution of dignity as other protest events in Ukraine, they're connected with fighting for independence, nation building. And when we check literature on gender and nation, for example, Mira Yuval Davis, Spike Patterson, and others, it's a very critical literature, and you could see that men are shown as heroes and women mainly as mothers of the nation. Women serve as symbolic makers of nation's cultural identity, and it's very visible later, I show this. And there is this metaphor of nation as a woman and woman as a nation, and women's bodies, they become a battleground of national struggles. And when we check thoroughly this patriarchal discourse of women's participation, So for women, there are two major roles. First of all, as mothers, those who care and help revolutionaries, but also as beautiful objects to inspire protesters. And do you remember that actually beauty is a traditional female resource, as for men is physical force. So this resource is also used. And in gender theory on labor market, we divide productive and reproductive labor. And reproductive labor, that is connecting with cleaning, cooking, bringing food, caring about clothes, and doing other things in order to keep life of around 1,000 people who's been living in a very compact protest space. And very often it's so-called backstage of protests. And some prominent female politicians and public figures, they had this notion of mothers of nation, and as according to this gender and nation theory that I referred when analyzing patriarchal discourse. So now let's have a look also in this patriarchal discourse. Usually it's supported by thanking the heroes, and of course mainly male heroes, because they are those who sacrifice their lives. Very often it's about ignoring women's contribution to Maidan. Also, we remember examples where men were asked women to, they asked women to leave protest space because it's very dangerous. And it's a very, I would say, paternalist discourse, where actually women are not allowed on the risky places and barricades for their own protection. But at the same time, of course, in this discourse, we may ask if women have the right to die on barricades, because in this patriarchal discourse, in order to become hero, you should sacrifice your life. And of course, the problem is usually that women are not allowed to do this, but at the same time, men are expected to do this. And those men who refused or who are not doing this, they are subordinated or marginalized. And actually, you could find some scholarship, some articles where Euromaidan protests are analyzed only through this discourse. But in my studies, what I try to show and claim that it became possible to criticize this. And all these examples that I will show later, they were criticized very often immediately, a number of times, but by different activists. And that is why actually it became, because it was revolution of dignity. So for women, it became possible to fight for their rights and visibility. And let's have a look on some very, I would say, bright pictures. Backstage of Euromaidan protests, famous kitchen of Maidan, usually around 100, mainly women, were those who are feeding protesters. As I said, around 1,000 people were constantly living on protest space. So it's very important work, but of course it's traditionally so-called female work. And there were a number of advertisements. For example, dear women, if you see garbage, clean it up. The male revolutionary will be pleased. There were examples of such quite sexist announcement. At the same time, they were criticized, of course, and discussed. And women, one of the major role, of course, for women, they are mothers of heroes. So we have a number of self-made postures like this, where women, they are caring mothers, and they help, they care for those men who their sons who are on protest spaces. And of course women were coming with posters mother, because of course they internalized their stereotypes and this notion that they are mothers who are worrying about their children rescuing their lives on Maidan. At the same time, in patriarchal discourse, there are a lot of victimized images. Women are those who are crying, they are suffering, they are bleeding, and usually you see that they, sisters, girlfriends, wives, are those who suffer and who needs to be rescued. And in the patriarchal discourse, especially in the situation where protests, they were lasting for 3-4 months, weddings, so traditional ceremony of marriage was a sign of legitimating and normalization of this revolutionary space. So we have a number of romantic examples where this happened, and usually it's a romantic story when he is a warrior hero, she's, for example, medic or some other volunteer helping on Maidan, and these stories, they normalize life in protest space that lasted a couple of months. Victimhood, as I said, it's connected also with national and very gendered image, because you see woman here symbolizes Ukraine, who is bleeding, crying, suffering. Moreover, it's she's suffering in the post-colonial relationships with Russia. There were a number of posters like this: Ukrainian blood, Russia hands off Ukraine, or leave me alone, big country, отстань, страна огромная, where we see that relationships between Ukraine and Russia are portrayed as a gendered and as a problematic, as a victimized and colonial relationships. Another interesting stance where you could see Vova, я ухожу от тебя, Vova, I go away from you, that this Ukraine-Russia relationships are portrayed as a happy marriage. And another example, you see the poster of a very famous LGBT activist, Zoryan Keys. Zoryan is Ukrainian speaking, but his poster is in Russian for referring to Putin. Putin, если любишь, отпусти. Putin, if you love me, let me go. That means that actually Ukraine as a country, she wants divorce in this very problematic relationships. Women of different age and very diverse women were participating in protests. Usually you see them with national female symbols like this: Crimea is not Russia. And even small kids were, having some posters like Ukraine couldn't be broken. At the same time, another image is beauty, another resource is beauty, very important in the situation where women as a group have less traditional resources, so-called. So beauty very often is used as a quite, I would say, alternative resource, even strategically. And there were a number of articles like "Most Beautiful Girls of Maidan Light the Spirit of the Revolution." And about female participant, we could read that women better feel risks, most of them, against aggression and violent action. So they are more peaceful creatures, so-called. And thanks to the ladies, at the Maidan Square of the country is a festive carnival atmosphere. They seem to be the muses who give a sense of joy and recovery. So gentrifying protest space, entertaining, it's one of the also traditional role. And you could see a number of examples where women making gray, dark protest space more feminine, more beautiful. And also women were entertaining protesters doing, for example, ballet on barricades. You could see some examples also of so-called visible femininity in a gray burnout protest space, where women coming consciously to make protest space more, feminine. Also, you could see this national symbols, flower crown, and this bright pink feminine colors. And of course, this was what expected from women. Women, as in this traditional discourse, they are a symbol of love and communication and understanding. So they are here. You could see they approaching to Berkut police, who are against people on Maidan and trying to don't не бий, рятуй країну з нами, don't beat us, save our country with us. And of course, in this discourse, in traditional discourse, men are expected to risk their lives. So even in this area of hegemonic masculinity, where heroes are, they are those who risk their lives. Those men who are not doing this, they are subordinated and they are marked with femininity. And there were so-called self-made posters where I translate, your husband does not go on Maidan, such as it's very dangerous. Don't forget to greet him with International Women's Day, 8th of March. In Ukraine, as another post-Soviet country, now situation is changing, but traditionally, as a Soviet legacy, usually this day of International Women's March is marked with, some nice postcards, flowers, and those men who are not risking lives, they are in a patriarchal discourse, so they are subordinated with this femininity. But at the same time, despite the fact that patriarchal discourse and practices, it was present on Euromaidan protests, because protests, they reflect the society. And of course, if in the society there are these major roles and these stereotypes, so it's very difficult to fulfill alternative gender roles. But at the same time, I see, and in my articles, I show a number of examples of so-called egalitarian discourse, where women and also men, they had choice and for them it became possible to challenge patriarchal gender roles and to provide alternative roles, even if it's not so easy. And Maidan is not a homogeneous phenomenon. It's rather diversity of different grassroots volunteer initiatives, and those initiatives are very visible when we analyze women's participations, because women were very actively present there. And also Maidan, Revolution of Dignity, created space for citizens to negotiate new strategy and to articulate the rights, and actually a number of changes that we see even now. And for like European societies, sometimes it's quite a surprise why Ukrainian society resists. I would say that there is this legacy from Revolution of Dignity and war in Donbass. So for last 8 years, it became quite a norm to do all these activities. Women managed to make revolution together with men, because besides doing traditional work, that is also very important. Yes, they were fighting on barricades, and those women who fight and who did paramilitary work, later they became volunteers in Donbass war. They were doing negotiation and peacekeeping, medical support, information support, legislative work, logistics, education, organization. Actually, Revolution of Dignity is not only about fighting on barricades, throwing Molotov cocktails, and doing, direct fights. But you could see it's a huge list of a lot of very important work that is connecting with this idea of dignity, where human rights is important, where actually, and the whole idea of this Euromaidan protest, where people were not supporting the decision of President Yanukovych, that is about civilization choice. Yes, not to move to Europe, but to somehow to choose between Europe and this Ruski Mir, Russian world. And a number of examples of this women's egalitarian participation in Kyiv and other cities. There were so-called first female squadrons, where women were doing paramilitary work on the military positions. And of course, sometimes it was not easy, but they were fighting for these rights, and there were women who choose to do this. Some women, they organize like Zhinocha Chata or female platoon, for example, of 16th Squadron of Maidan self-defense. If you remember, because of this threat from Berkut police, Euromaidan protest that in the very beginning was a peaceful protest, was forced to become a paramilitary space to defend people who's been there. And when students were heavily beaten by Berkut police, so it became clear that unfortunately violence will be during this event. So these paramilitary functions, they were also very important. Euromaidan protest, it's a lot about very ordinary people. So when we compare information and scholarship from, for example, Orange Revolution that happened in 2004, you could see that it's a lot about, not a lot about real people, but more about like political elite. For example, Yulia Tymoshenko became very famous after Orange Revolution, and she is actually one of the famous politicians. But here in the situation of revolution of dignity, we have a lot of stories of very ordinary people like this Oksana from Crimea. In more egalitarian discourse, you see that women, they are not victims, and they use national symbols, military, but at the same time, they are those who are ready to fight. And you see here some agency, and there were a number of these military posters with women eager to fight and ready to, to throw Molotov cocktails, etc. Women were building barricades together with men. When you look at a number of pictures and documentaries from Maidan, you could see that really women of different age groups, they were present there doing different activities. Even old women, you see they were attacking police and were not afraid to be on this quite dangerous protest space. Also, I claim that there is this so-called Soviet legacy where this mainly older women, they used to get deficit resources from Soviet times, when was shortage of products. And in this so-called shadow gender contract, where for women were not so easy to get resources, they use different strategies. And in this case, you see women don't have cars to bring boots, and so they just bring it manually in the subway, for example. And we could see a number of these examples where just very simple women, they do whatever they want to benefit to protest space. Some women were risking their lives. For example, volunteer Olesa Zhukovska, she tweeted, "I'm dying." She was struck by a metal bullet. Olesa survived, and of course she became quite famous. But there were a number of unfamous women like this, I would say unknown activist. She suffered from a police grenade, but you see she continues to be and to work in this, to be in this protest space to provide, to help wounded people. Of course, a lot work as a medical support. Women were actively involved in this in these activities. I personally was also actually was involved in one of such activities, and would like to say that of course we have a man, but still all this I would say backstage, all these hotlines, women were very actively participating. Women were organizing anti-violence protest actions and even giving their small kids to Berkut police in order to have this communication, so they were not afraid. They were doing a number of creative protests, usually, for example, with toys, with Berkut police. Women were addressing police, protect me, because actually the major idea of police is to protect ordinary people, not to protect politicians who are not popular and who support, who abuse violence. Feminist group of women were organizing Night of Women's Solidarity, where they were claiming that women are not only doing sandwiches on Maidan, but they built barricades, and they were using this gender-sensitive language like glory, not only glory to heroes, but glory to heroines. Also, we were thinking what to do on International Women's Day, 8th of March, with how to, with which slogans to come. And Crimea was already actually annexed, so we came with this solidarity slogans, women of Maidan to women of Crimea. You could see it's written in a different languages, even in the Crimea Tatar language. On Maidan, there were also other alternative projects, for example, hospital guard, safety transportation, Euromaidan ZOiS, and other hotlines. And actually, these initiatives, for 8 years, they active even now. After Maidan, education project for university with public lectures, because as I said, 3-4 months people are living in a protest space, so it's important to do something, and education is one of the important issues. Student centers, civic sector of Maidan, life stories about ordinary people from Maidan. Also, there were also so-called left, black, or anarchist Maidan. And in all these activities where women were very actively present, and I'd like to summarize that Euromaidan, Revolution of Dignity, was heterogeneous space with a lot of initiatives, and they could be visible through women participation. And discourse was not only patriarchal or exclusive, as you could see from some scholarship, but also egalitarian, inclusive. And it became possible for women to claim their rights, claim their dignity, to criticize gender discrimination. And women were not helpers, but makers of this revolution. And I want to do here a bridge to war that started in Donbass in spring 2014. And some women, those who were active on Euromaidan protests and others, they decided to join anti-terrorist military operation and to become volunteers. And there were no official data, but in October 2014, there were around 1,000 women participating in this anti-terrorist operation. And one of such women, Maria Berlinska, who is graduate of my university, Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and who's been doing air reconnaissance activities and education in air reconnaissance, so working with drones. She came to me and asked for help to organize a sociological study about women's participation in the Donbass war and about their labor rights in military, because it appeared that both Maria and other women they are, as a volunteers, they participate in a combat activities. Like, for example, they do reconnaissance, they drive military vehicles, they are snipers, but because this work, these positions were not allowed as military positions, so they were officially they were either not recognized at all or officially in the documents they were written as, for example, bookkeeper or some other more traditional female activities. So they asked for help with the study, and we conducted sociological study in 2015. We call it metaphorically invisible battalion, because, as I said, 1,000 women, and these women, they were invisible for the armed forces, for the society, and it became interesting that firstly we wanted, of course, anonymity for our respondents. We were interviewing around 50 women and some men. And of course, we understood that it's a very sensitive topic, but later our respondents, they were fighting, they decided to fight for their rights. And they, for example, we also produced this calendar where you could see these women, and they were interested to make some changes in the military and in the armed forces. And it's a very clear example of public sociology. Yes, where you cooperate with different groups of people who are interested in changing situation in the country. And women in the armed forces of Ukraine, they were present, but they were taken mainly feminized professions. Yes, in nurses, finance, logistics, and communication. There was gender discrimination and paternalism, because actually state was officially protecting women from taking so-called dangerous and heavy positions in labor market. It was a list of around 450 positions forbidden for women in civilian life. And of course, if it's for women, if for women it's not allowed to drive some types of vehicles, like for example train, subway, train, and ordinary trains. So in the military, for women, it was not allowed to drive military vehicle and to hold other combat positions. So we were working with this, and actually, as a result of our studies, we were presenting it, and there were some protests from military women. In the next years, in 2016, some changes happened. This sociological study, Invisible Battalion, it became advocacy campaign, lobbying authorities, and Ukraine actually adopted National Action Plan on UN Security Council Resolution 1625, Women, Peace and Security, and it's about visibility of women in peace building. Ministry of Defense in June 2016 opened 63 staff positions for women, combat positions. So actually, Ministry of Defense, they did their own studies. They checked where women are present, in which combat positions, and actually it became possible to fight horizontal and also vertical gender segregation, and the Ministry of Defense launched strategy of gender equality, and also for lobbying documentary Invisible Battalion with 6 life stories of military women was released. Another issue that we tried to raise, it's actually connected with veterans. We had documentary No Obvious Sign about post-traumatic stress disorder that veterans face. And as far as in Ukraine, as a result of Donbass war, currently there are 500,000 veterans, so there are a number of problems that they face with integration, and women are very visible group of veterans. Women veterans movement is very active in Ukraine, so they go abroad. Some of them are politicians. So some of them now fight in after this invasion. And in general, I would like to say that we conducted already 3 sociological studies. So in 2015, we started with general overview of women's participation in Donbass war, or it officially was called anti-terrorist operation. The second, our Invisible Battalion, was about women veterans returning to peaceful life, about special visibility of women, special needs. And the third study was on a very sensitive topic on sexual harassment in the military sphere. Actually, we experienced quite a lot of changes in the Ukrainian armed forces because it became possible, even now there are 2 court cases on sexual harassment, and it became possible to raise the issue also of, for example, bullying in armed forces, suicide, sexual harassment, and other problems that are important not only for women but for men. We launched online course Gender Equality and Combating Sexual Harassment in the Military in 2021, and currently after the 1 year of this online course on Prometheus platform, I think around 25,000 military already took it. Currently, we are doing research on women's access to military education because it's actually only 3 years ago, military colleges and in general, all military higher education institutions, they made it possible for women to enter them, and for better integration in the military labor market, it's very important to have access to military education. So if you want to learn more, just go to our project webpage, Invisible Battalion. It's a real result. It's a group of, it's a huge team, around 50 people. Our sociological team is around, I would say, 5, but there are a lot of other components and actors and military women who are also now fighting in this war. And what do we have now in the armed forces of Ukraine? The latest data that are taken from media, it shows that actually in the armed forces, the total number of service women, 33,000, it's around 20%. And 17,000 women, they became veterans. 9 women died during last years of Donbass war. Also, currently there are 3 female generals from 2018. First time in Ukraine, women obtained the military status of general. So for women, it became possible to fight glass ceiling and to fight this not only horizontal segregation to enter more traditional male positions, but also, vertical segregation. And another change that happened with the presidency of Petro Poroshenko. He signed the law on equal rights of women and men while serving in the armed forces, especially in a contract army, because before, even for women to enter contract army, there were some problems. And in Ukraine, there is, of course, obligatory draft and for all men, but so for women, it became quite problematic before even to enter contract army, but now situation is changing. And the whole idea, of course, was to make armed forces more professional, very comfortable for both women and men. And you see that this for last 7-8 years, that actually when you see now how Ukrainian armed forces, so you may understand that a number of reforms, of course, happened, and women were very active in pushing these reforms. And in my studies, I try to show this legacy between all these events, as I said. Euromaidan protests, Voidenbas, and currently in this women's involvement in this war as a result of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. And in my recent studies, I look on women's involvement through two major perspectives. Because first of all, when you take literature on gender and war, women are portrayed as victims, as vulnerable groups. But this is a problem because I also claim that women are not only victims, they are actors of resistance, those who have agency and who actively participate in different forms of activities. To show general overview of women as victims, of course, they are majority those who were forced to become refugees and those who are responsible for caring of their families, because men mainly they fight or they can't live, so women are responsible for children, elderly. Women are those who are victims of sexual violence, rapes, and there were a number of examples of this. And also women are potential and victims of sex trafficking as those who actually forced to leave their country. But at the same time, when you look at the posters, compared to posters to Maidan, I'm still in the process of doing research, but I see that there are much more posters with, not with victimhood, but with resistance, where women are those who were forced and who are taking arms and who resist. And a number of examples of this. I just show you some visuality where you could see that it's resistance with arms, and this group of military women, they refer to Russian soldiers. Yeah, that if you come here, we will kill you. You see women of different, older women, they take arms, older women and different groups of women, they help and they resist in a very different way. And this picture of woman with a son who is rescuing from Irpin these disabled dogs, you see that this example became this photo. It was turned to a poster and it became actually very known in international media as a symbol of resistance. Another poster is from Berlin protest. As far as I said, women are those who are majority from refugees, so they organize a number of protests, they participate in them, and they want that international community to hear about this war. Also, we have some results of public opinion surveys where we could see that for example, in the beginning of March, InfoSapiens for the British Research Agency conducted research where actually it was all Ukrainian national representative pool, and 67% were ready to personally participate in the armed resistance to end the Russian occupation. And among them, 78% males, almost 60% females. So majority of women were ready in the beginning of March to participate in the armed resistance to end occupation. And also women are those, as I said, stereotypically women are perceived as a very peaceful creatures. But Ukrainian women, we as Ukrainian women are forced in these circumstances to arm Ukraine now. A number of women, they use their opportunity and this hashtag arm Ukraine now to ask for heavy weapon. For example, Maria Berlinska, whom I mentioned, she was one who initiated Invisible Battalion project. She is a veteran, volunteer, women's rights advocate, and you know, she's coming like here to US, to American politicians to ask for weapons. Also, human rights defenders like Alexandra Matvichuk, she coordinates the documentation of war crimes Tribunal for Putin Coalition. Once I was with her in one event, and Alexandra was asking and explaining why Ukraine needs heavy weapon. So she's also using this hashtag, and she is so she explains why it's necessary, especially in order to fight, to fight genocide of Ukrainian people. Even there are a number of feminist debates in Ukraine and abroad what to do with weapon and with militarization, and a feminist and editor of Gender in Details online resource Tamara, she explains also in her Facebook why it's important to help Ukraine with a weapon and why feminists ask for this, because in a more critical feminist discourse, feminists usually are against militarization. And we have examples of some international feminists who would like to say that, who are very critical towards this, but Ukrainian feminists, radical feminists, Daria Cymbaluk and Irina Zamuraeva, in her article, they explain why, even in the situations that they are critical to militarization, they believe that pacifism will kill, and that Russia's war crimes have left with no option. So if you have extra question on this, you may ask about, but it's also a very important issue even for feminist debates, because all scholarships and theories, they are usually written from the perspective of more academic scholars who represent Western countries, those who were actually, who were not like Ukraine now under bombing and under situation of genocide of their own people. Recognition of, I'm finishing very slowly, and would like to say that even in a culture and art, you could see that women's involvement into this war is recognized. And Kalish, if you followed Eurovision's song contest this year, you probably know that Ukrainian band Kalish Orchestra won with Stefania's song, and I strongly advise you to watch clip that was released as a result of this song, because it contributes to the visibility of thousands of Ukrainian female soldiers who defend their country, their home, and their children. And I like to finish my talks with some mythology, because in Ukrainian myths and in general in European mythology, you know, there is this idea of witches, and witches are very gendered image. And in Ukraine, in the situation where politicians, people were asking for a heavy weapon and were asking to shelter sky, and this help was not provided. So there are a number of self-made posters and jokes where you could see here Ukrainian witches, they say, girls, let's close the sky. And this image of witches, witchcraft, valkyrias is used also by Ukrainian military women. Sometimes they call themselves witches. Also in the situation, even in jokes, some military, they use this notion of Ukrainian witches who are fighting enemy, and this mythological aspects is also very interesting direction to study, and I encourage you to do this. And I will finish here. I am very grateful for your attention, and if you have questions, so ask them, or you may write in my email. And I would like to thank again for ZOiS and for Professor Gwendolyn for their position to stand with Ukraine and for making Ukrainian studies visible.
Thank you so much, Tamara. That was quite a tour de force through a lot of context, images, and also very, very powerful messages towards the end in particular. While people get ready to write, I think, questions and comments in the chat, which I will then pick up, I was wondering if we go also back to the imagery you showed about the Euromaidan protests, but maybe it also holds later on for the war in Donbass and then the sort of expanded war now. Kind of what are the origins really of the images? No? So there are probably several, no? Sort of that some are produced by, and I mean images in the visual image, but also kind of the image of the male or female roles in these extreme situations. Sort of the actors themselves probably create some of it, then society, media, but also probably outside views as well that get picked up. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, about origins, and then also sort of effects of that on society. I mean, obviously we can't say yet beyond the current war, but beyond the Euromaidan protests, sort of what are the effects of that, and in where do you see it in society once kind of a big crisis moment of political crisis moment is over? So what kind of effects do you see kind of beyond the moment? And I mean, it's too early obviously to say with regard to the war, where you highlighted in particular kind of the more visible and also acknowledgement of women's role in different roles in the war. And I think probably part of the question revolves around kind of what I think you mentioned very early, or what was probably the main idea also of the title of your talk, kind of the participants. No? So ultimately, I think what's really required is this reframing of sort of that only this one role counts as this or counts as that, but that actually it's a reframing of what participation in protest or participation in war means. No? So it's not, I didn't understand you now as saying kind of, okay, now we need to obviously see women engaged in military action or armed resistance, but isn't it also about this broader point that participation just means something kind of bigger than maybe what is thought of, and who is actively engaged in that reframing? No? Sort of that is also kind of a wider societal task that's not going to be done by a kind of gender equality strategy in the Ministry of Defense or in the army. And I mean, those are all components of it probably, but ultimately it's also this wider reframing, I think, of participation. So I don't know, maybe you can pick up something from there, and I kind of look through the chat for the moment as well.
Thanks a lot. Maybe I will start with participation. I think you're absolutely right. The problem is that very often, as I tried to show, usually those who risk their lives and those who are in the front line, so-called, of protests and war, are those who are mainly recognized. And I see how from Euromaidan this situation is changing. And even now in the discourse of current invasion, where Ukraine needs, of course, more soldiers, military fight and support, I think that, there is this notion that the whole country is volunteering and people doing very different participation. Like, for example, I personally, as a person from academia, I think that my participation in the way is to make Ukrainian studies in academia more visible, to decolonize it from like Russian studies, where very often in this Eastern European, Russian and Eurasian studies, you see that Ukraine and even Belarus is much more marginalized, and very often results of research, they are shared for all countries, and somehow people believe that Russian society are very similar to Ukrainian one. And so this participation and backstage, so I call it a backstage of revolution and protests. It's very important, and also it's very important in this current war, because only with military participation is combat participation is very important. And you see that for, of course, veterans, they are major force of this, and people in armed forces, major force of this. At the same time, it's very important other forms, information, logistics. It's very important to do legislative work. You know, these examples of tribunal for Putin coalition, whatever. It's important really to do this information fight. And now we see that it's really the discourse about this involvement is much more diverse in a way that you could hear quite often. The whole country is volunteering. Yes, even volunteer activities that became very popular, that even I would say 10 years ago, it was not an issue in Ukraine. So currently it's a very visible. As for visuality, with Euromaidan, it's much easier because in general, so a lot of my major source is Facebook. I personally very active in Facebook and in Facebook groups, and actually my title, they are Facebook self-made avatars of women, very diverse women, and compare, for example, to Orange Revolution, where internet was not so active and used. With Euromaidan was absolutely other situation, and you could follow all events from like Facebook. Twitter is also, but less popular. It's a bit different tool. So a lot of sources. It's Facebook pictures. A majority of them are without authors, so that is why it's very very tricky to publish them because they don't have a source. Currently, with this war, much of this visuality, there are already artists who produce them. So I would say that you could see now a number of interesting visual products with women, with femininity, with particular artists, and it's somehow, I would say, everybody wants to create something, and for artists, it's also an issue. With Euromaidan, it's a bit different. It's very, and we do have a number of, I think, scholarships, books on this so-called folklore, on this different images, also stories, anecdotes that ordinary people produced, and you can't find very often. You can't find the author or these different memes that are produced. But this visuality, of course, it's very interesting, and it's possible to analyze. And I hope in the future, I, for example, want to analyze some hashtags. I did it with hashtag I am not afraid to say it. It's a hashtag campaign that in Ukraine was started in 2016 with also activist Anastasia Melnichenko. It's about men talking on sexual violence, and it was before Me Too. And so it's interesting, and it's possible to analyze some hashtags, even hashtag Arm Ukraine Now. That I also claim that women, because majority of Facebook users, as far as I remember, are women, so they are very actively use it to ask for a weapon and to look like, you know, militarized, that for some academia and for some scholars it looks not very, I would say, appropriate. But this visuality, the change, it's very interesting source of analysis, so you're absolutely right. As for the second question, I don't remember exactly. It was about perspectives and women in politics or something.
No, it was actually more sort of the first question, I think, was more the different origins of these images, no? While something like the protest is going on, that it sort of originates in different places, I suppose, or during the war. And then what are the effects or short and long-term effects of that on society? And we just actually had another question in the chat by Kerstin coming in, who also says that she sensed from your presentation that your project, that you project a more gender inclusive Ukrainian society after the Euromaidan, apart from the kind of the military aspect. And where do you see the most profound changes, and have there been backlashes? Maybe that's connected to my point also about the effects. So the origins of different images, and then what sticks and actually has an effect beyond kind of that moment or period of time in a protest or in a war.
Yeah, thanks a lot. As I tried to say, the origin is actually just people. So very often with Euromaidan, of course, there are some artists who produce, and there are some projects with these images, but origin just, you know, unknown people from unknown people, and these images, they were very actively shared in Facebook and other social media, and they were used actually by some protesters, by people. Some images were particularly created for women's self-defense units or women's soldiers. Like, for example, it was one, but it was, I would say, sometimes it was a request to create some particular images, especially for military women. But I think that it resulted, of course, in the demand to see alternative roles for women, for men. Masculinity is another interesting issue for analysis. I just did, because of lack of time, it could be separate lecture on male images. And you see the same, how they changing now. And I do believe that as a result of the of Euromaidan protests, a number of changes happened. First of all, of course, in the armed forces, because war started, and because, of course, in the situation where not all men want to go to armed forces, and as a result of the collapse of Soviet Union, armed forces got very low prestige, low money, and men didn't want to go as it was in Soviet times, where with masculinity, in order to become man, to socialize, you are supposed to be in the armed forces. In 90s, the situation was that a number of men, they were trying to escape draft in a different ways, with corruption, also entering universities, because it's one of the way. And in this situation, if women want, so why not? Women were always used by state as a reserve labor force. It was very visible during Second World War. And actually, in our Invisible Battalion study, we were inspired, for example, by Svetlana Alexeyevich book «У войны не женское лицо». War doesn't have women's face, with interviews with women veterans of Second World War. And, there were a lot of women. Some women became icons icons by Soviet army, but only some of them, like Lyudmila Pavlyuchenko, famous sniper, who helped to open Second Front and who came to US with Soviet delegation. And actually, Lyudmila Pavlyuchenko is from Odessa. But other women, when they return home, their family were ashamed that what they were doing in the army, in the war with men. So we experienced in interviews similar stories, and it was very against dignity of those women who had patriotic views and who wanted to defend their country. And of course, this current war and women's active grassroots participation, it helped to make some changes. And even such very a patriarchal traditional structure as armed forces couldn't resist. So, and you see that year by year, women received access to different, to different positions. They become more visible. Different cases of sexism is criticized. What is important, there are men military who sincerely believes that it should be gender equality. And for 7 years, we do have these changes. And just to other changes happened in politics before Euromaidan. In Verkhovna Rada, in Ukrainian parliament, women never managed to have at least 10%. Now there are 20% of women, younger generations of women, they managed to enter Verkhovna Rada. Finally, Ukraine introduced gender quotas. I know the gender quotas are very controversial mechanism, but I personally do support it a lot. And I was in a group with 15 years, I think, promoting the idea of gender quotas in Ukrainian political parties, and it finally happened with very good mechanisms, and we have much more women in politics. Even now, even in the situation of war, there are famous women, ministers, Irina Vereshchuk, others who do negotiation, who release Ukrainian soldiers and civilians from captivity. So you see much more women in top politics. Also, as for gender-based violence and sexual violence, it became possible to talk openly. As I said, #campaign, I am not afraid to say it. It happened even before Me Too. And it became possible to talk on sexual harassment in universities. There were some loud cases where professors were fired. Our Kyiv-Mohyla Academy became the first university to implement internal university policies against sexual harassment and for gender equality. Court cases in sexual harassment in military, as I said, in general, Ukrainians don't trust courts, and courts are rather corrupted, and it's very difficult to have positive court cases. So we do see a number of changes, and a couple of days ago, finally, Istanbul Convention was ratified. It's a huge victory that Ukrainian civil society was going for like 11 years. And so I would say that it's possible. It's possible to see a number of changes, but also because different actors are involved, and civil society activists, organizations are, I would say, a very important actor in this, in these changes and in this activism. I also see that there are some questions in the chat, so maybe I could answer.
Yes, Victoria is asking, yeah, pick it up yourself, but Victoria is asking if you could comment a bit on the gendered experiences and dangers of displacement.
No, thanks a lot. It's really, when we look at statistics, so we could see that women among those who are becoming forced refugees, and usually there are different generations of women, and who migrate with their children and with their parents, with elderly. So a great challenge for them is some of them didn't travel before abroad. So it's actually, I would say, a challenge and risk to do this. It's a risk as in general for migration, risk of sex trafficking. But what is very important that about this, there are quite a lot of information, like what to do and how to avoid this. And in general, when we take Ukraine after independence in 90s, women were in 90s majority from labor migrants, and you see that actually already there are a lot of women in receiving communities among those Ukrainians who are living abroad quite a lot. So I think it's very helpful. They really help to integrate for newcomers. But another risk is that some women who migrate, they are victims of violence and rapes. And in some countries like Poland, it's not possible to have abortion. And so psychological health is a problem for this. Also, women are, as I said, those who care for others, and in order for them to do their, for example, volunteer activity or to earn money, they need to have a very good caring infrastructure for children in the receiving country. And it's really, it's one of the challenge also for those women who have dependents, how to, you know, to combine this triple burden, because you need to earn money, you need to volunteer. A lot of have this syndrome that they are not doing enough for their country, and at the same time you should care for children and for like elderly. So it's one of the, I would say, one of the also dilemmas of those who migrate abroad. As for question about from Larissa Tamilina, how I can compare horizontal and vertical segregation of women in Ukraine and in the EU. Compared to France, Sweden, for instance, it's of course. So I would say some EU, as far as in general, EU countries, they differ between themselves as for gender equality implementation, and all the EU members, especially Nordic countries, they are much better in different indexes, and so-called new members or recent, not far recent members, former post-socialist countries, they may have a bit different situation, but it's perceived that the best situation is in Nordic countries, especially as for women's visibility in a top position. And another issue I would say very important for gender equality is how men involved in caring activities, and if it's possible for men to take parental leave. And changes happened also in Ukraine, I would like to say, because officially, of course, as a Soviet legacy, men could take parental leave, but unpaid, and usually men don't do this because of wage gap, and for family it's more, I would say, convenient that women would take, and Nordic countries could be a good example where state supports and where there are affirmative actions in this situation, but at the same time, compared to some EU countries, women are more involved in the labor market, especially on full-time, because it's part-time work has, I would say, it's from one hand, it's a good for women. At the same time, later you have less pension and you earn much less compared to men. So still in Ukraine, women are rather actively involved in labor market. But you are right, there is this problem of vertical horizontal segregations. Largest changes happened in armed forces. I explained why, because of war. Also, we see some changes in politics in general, in labor market, in education. What is interesting in Ukraine, Yes, in general, in Europe, women are those who receive higher education, but of course later there is a problem that state doesn't have enough labor in labor market places for them with such high level of education. And there is this gap between traditional male and female education, and it's the issues that should be also solved.
Thank you. There's another question by Tatiana in the chat asking what you think about the idea of military preparations or training for Ukrainian women, something similar to what male students go through at university, she says. This could become mandatory. Is there support, or would there be support in your view for this in Ukrainian society? Are there certain models in other countries?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think with the current invasion, we should face in Ukraine the situations that we need to change the whole idea of education and training, because the problem actually in Ukraine is secondary education, that there are still gender segregated classes where, for example, men, boys, they're doing more paramilitary or military trainings, women more medical. I do support the idea of gender neutral and effective education for all, so that you train, I would say, in a good way, both women and men. I think that this idea of providing training for those who want is very good idea. I don't think that we need time and quite a lot of resources to provide like obligatory trainings for all citizens. I don't think that it's possible to do, but at least there should be possibility. And what I know from my friends, colleagues, that actually even before invasion and now it's quite possible. There are a lot of those who will to have this training, both actually men and women. So it would be great if those who would like to have this training and who do feel that they want to be involved in military, paramilitary activities, they should learn how to do this. What I really like and support, it's professional military education for men and women. And as I said, from 2019, so this education officially opened. And in the most prestigious military college named by Ivan Bohun, I think in the first academic year, they had 25 girls. The next year, they had 50 and 50. So actually, it became possible, but still there is this dilemma of gender sensitive and gender neutral education and training. Because the problem is that according to some norms and legislation, for example, for women, for the sake of security and some other issues, you should have separate premises, and you should have like separate sleeping places, whatever, and it's not so easy to implement. And sometimes, in some armed forces, there were some experiments where women and men were living together, and like in Norway, for example, there were some examples, and there are beliefs that it's even better to prevent, for example, sexual harassment when you have common казарms where women and men live together. But because of these norms of gender sensitive approach, there should be time and resources to build particular infrastructure to integrate more women into military education.
Thank you. And Tatiana is just adding to that as well, that civil defense workshops, something like survival guides for citizens, had become extremely popular already since December, so before the full-scale invasion. So that maybe another element of that, no, with the emphasis also on survival or the civil defense as well. I think, Tamara, we'll have to leave it here for the moment. And I'd like to thank you again so much for your talk, your research. And I think you really brought out both the gender dynamics of protest and war, but then also the changes that can occur in perceptions, in policies, in actions, in agency through protest and war. So thank you so much for that. And we will be following your ongoing research with great interest, and I'm sure we'll catch up with you on this in due course. So thank you so much again. And let me briefly also say that next week we'll meet again at 5:30. Today that was an exception that we started slightly later. And next week we will be joined by Oksana Mikhaeva from the Ukrainian Catholic University, who will talk on from spontaneous help to organize civil society and volunteering in the context of forced population displacement. So probably we'll take some of the issues you talked about today forward into next week's discussion as well. So thank you again, and we'll close it for now, but we'll be in touch. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot for organizing this, and to all participants and viewers for your attention to and interest in the situation in Ukraine.